The Ben 10 franchise has never been one to be afraid to wear its inspirations on its sleeve. On top of having creators like Dwayne McDuffie, who previously worked on Teen Titans, Justice League, as well as writing a few comics for both Marvel and DC, the series itself started off as a concept for the new era of DC Comics' dull H for hero. So now that we've established a sort of general connection between Ben 10 and all sorts of comic book series, let's get into my main point here. Time and time again when watching this series, I've seen parallels between Ben Tennyson and Peter Parker of Spider-Man fame. On a surface level, broadly speaking, their appearances aren't too dissimilar. The most popular versions of each of these characters are both teens. I know more often than not, Spider-Man appears as an adult in the comics, but speaking more broadly, the version of Peter Parker people think of is in his late teens, like with most of his live-action or animated adventures. And before we move on from sort of surface-level comparisons, they're both superheroes, but we'll touch on that more later. Both of these characters are victims of circumstance. Their journeys both begin with an inciting incident outside of their control. Peter with the radioactive spider bite, and Ben stumbling across the Omnitrix. Just quickly here, if you're enjoying what I do here and you want to help out the channel, I'd really appreciate if you subscribed. Otherwise, if you want to share it around, that would be greatly appreciated. Otherwise, I just appreciate you engaging with the content. Back to it. And though they've got very different levels of involvement in their relatives' lives, both Uncle Ben and Grandpa Max are major influences on Ben and Peter respectively. With Uncle Ben instilling a moral compass in Peter with the classic line, "With great power comes great responsibility," which I'm sure you've heard countless times at this point, giving Peter a pretty nifty phrase that sort of defines his character from that point moving forwards. That and Uncle Ben's death is the most defining event of Peter Parker's life, even rivaling the moment he was given his powers in the first place. One made him a superhuman and the other made him Spider-Man. While as Max is more of a mentor figure who sort of guides Ben and gives him a role model, particularly in the classic series, Ben has a more gradual lesson taught to him. Then later in Alien Force, after Grandpa Max wasn't always there, he becomes more of an Uncle Ben-like figure before coming back into the story. And as a result of these prominent role models in their lives, both Ben and Peter go through major growth. That along with the other side characters surrounding them, along with the mistakes each of these characters make along the way. In a similar way to Uncle Ben's passing, Spider-Man's biggest mistake was a defining moment. He let a burglar escape, which led to the death of his uncle. While in a sort of similar way to his relationship with Grandpa Max, Ben made lots of more smaller mistakes over time. Ben treated the Omnitrix like a toy and saw being a hero as something fun rather than facing the responsibilities of it all. Before later seeing the weight of all of it with thinking he lost people like Gwen or Grandpa Max. What I'm getting at is that both of these characters, while going about it in different ways, really learned the same lesson. Even if Ben in particular had to learn that lesson time and time again, particularly towards the end of Ultimate Alien Force, and then go on to embody being a hero, the good and the bad aspects of that. Before we get into some of the additional characters, thinking about the start of Ben's journey in Classic made me draw comparisons to Spider-Man. Ben getting the Omnitrix and ending the first season with his conflict against Vilgax would be the rough equivalent of Spider-Man getting his powers and being confronted by Thanos shortly thereafter. Not that Thanos is particularly part of Spider-Man's rogues gallery, but I couldn't really think of a more apt comparison there. Going into this, I felt like there are a lot more Ben 10 villains who are more or less a one-for-one replacement of Spider-Man's villains, but looking at them side by side, that really isn't the case here. They've both got a colourful cast of villains that really enrich the world they inhabit, while at the same time managing to feel like characters of their own. Some villains certainly draw inspiration from Spider-Man's rogues gallery. The parallel between Kyber and Kraven come to mind, but even that is less of an equivalent and more of a character archetype. The only real example and the character that inspired this video beyond general observations being Will Harang, who really is a carbon copy of J. Jonah Jameson. Both characters doing a wonderful job at running smear campaigns against their respective heroes, Will Harang with Ben and J. Jonah Jameson with Spider-Man. Though Will Harang is a bit of a flanderized version of J. Jonah, being a bit more two-dimensional without the depth of his counterpart. If we're talking more generally here, I see Kevin as quite a good stand-in for Ben's Venom equivalent, particularly in the classic series. The characters have a real history with one another. Then, like Venom having all of Spider-Man's powers plus his own, Kevin gets all of Ben's powers on top of his osmosis abilities. I was going to give that a bit of a caveat with Kevin's redemption come Alien Force, but seeing as Venom is much more of an anti-hero than a villain now, I think that works quite nicely. On a more general note, Dr. Animo is the perfect sort of mad scientist type. He could so easily slot into Spider-Man's rogue gallery, and if he weren't an established Ben 10 character, he'd feel right at home. Albedo could also sort of fit that Venom role, the colour swap villain of the main character, though that's more of a stretch than Kevin is. Less strictly to Spider-Man, there's certainly quite a few Ben 10 characters who have comic book counterparts. Moving away from Spider-Man a bit and speaking more generally on comic book counterparts, and something I've touched on before, Vilgax feels like a stand-in for your Thanos or your Darkseid types. Particularly in the Alien Force era, Vilgax always reminded me of Thanos in the way he was out in the universe conquering and finding ways to upgrade himself and make himself more powerful. At a really major stretch, you could compare the Forever Knights to Marvel's organisations like Hive or Hydra, but I'm not so committed to that. Going back to Ben and Peter themselves, they've got very similar senses of humour. Peter's more witty and relies on quips, while Ben's just more of a general goof. Peter seems more risk-adverse, There's a temptation here to discuss what would happen if these two characters met and came to blows, but I don't really see a world where these characters would be on opposing sides. At most, I can see a sort of quick scuffle in line with when Ben met Rex in the Heroes United crossover. Visuals aside, I suppose what I've worked out is that Spider-Man and Ben fit similar archetypes of what a superhero is, even if they both go about it in quite different ways. The parallels are clear, and while I don't feel like they're too dissimilar as people, are well and truly their own characters with their own universes, and if nothing else, both of these characters are defined by power and responsibility. If you have any thoughts or feelings on what I've said here, I'd love to hear it, or if you have any comparisons of your own, I'd love to hear them. Otherwise, thanks for watching.